Welcome to the great conversation where ideas matter. Ideas shape markets. Ideas can change the world. A while back, I was able to get involved in a conversation with Reed Hayes at the University of Florida. He's a very busy man. He's not only a research scientist at U of F, but also a criminologist within the College of Engineering. But I know him best through his work in the Loss Prevention Research Council, which is incredible because we're going to hear today from an incredible ecosystem of influencers that are working with him to supply evidence-based needs of the retail marketplace. Companies like Target, Walmart, and new technology companies like Intel and NVIDIA. So I can't wait to get an update on what he's been up to, because it's kind of the canary in cage on how we might think of our future. Welcome to the great conversation, Reed.
Really excited to be back again, Ron. Thank you.
Let's just do a quick baseline, just so people know where you're coming from in the following conversation. So give us a little more granularity on what you're doing right now.
Well, what we're doing is about 35 things, but at the center of everything is always our guiding principle, and that is safeguarding vulnerable people and places. That's always where we start. That's where we end. So when people talk about ethics, if we talk about inclusion, if we talk about safety and security, whatever it is, we start there and we end there. Let's safeguard the vulnerable. So we work on theft, we work on fraud prevention, we work on violence, and everything in between. And so we've got a pretty large mandate. In fact, everything but cybersecurity. And we've got our hands full. I've got a team of 4 other criminologists that work with and for me, and a research assistant as well. And then we work with interns, right, and other faculty and graduate students here. But we're still understaffed, undermanned because of all the issues that we all are dealing with. But right now, fast-paced change, and our primary focus is retailing. And retailing is really a great ecosystem to be involved with, because we're talking about distribution centers or fulfillment centers, all the trucking and transport. We've got traveling executives around the world. We've got massive computer systems selling websites. We've got parking lot issues. We've got corporate and regional divisional office environments. We've got manufacturing plants. They might make yogurt, or they might make something else that they sell in their stores, clothing, for example. Oh, and we've got the stores themselves. And most of the retailers we will deal with have hundreds or thousands and thousands of locations. So we've got our hands full, Ron.
Well, also, I mentioned at the beginning here, you've also brought in technology companies as a key part of the ecosystem and partnering with defining that future. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I don't know if I mentioned before, my father and grandfather, being physicians, I, for whatever reason, would read some of their journals, listen to these horrific tapes they would listen to in their vehicles while they were moving around, continuing education. But I learned that early detection, and we all know this and heard this many times, early detection is always better. Early detection, but also accurate diagnosis is better. So the sooner and the more we know, the more we have a chance of getting ready. And so we take it to the individual level with everything we do. An individual offender makes choices. Almost never, ever are they forced to do these things, but rather they make voluntary choices. I'm going to be a thief. I'm going to victimize this place as a shop. I'm going to be a shoplifter. I'm going to steal this merchandise this way. I'm going to convert to cash this way, or whatever is going on. The same with robbers and burglars and everybody else. So we try and understand the decision process of humans. Not easy and still evolving, but we look at the steps and stages the individual offender takes to be successful in their mind. Some might cynically call it a good day for a bad guy. Those steps, those stages are aiming points, they're targets for us to have align sensors, to put action tools in place, and then refine and understand. So that's what we're doing, Ron, and some is aligning these sensors. And as a social behavioral scientist, there's no way I could design a sensor, the compute, I can't build AI models necessarily, but we're the use case guys. So that's what we're doing with the big tech guys and the little tech guys with all that innovation.
It's so poignant. We are taking a simple axiom of called a business model, and we've been applying it now across the board. I was talking to a former FBI analyst, and they use the term kill chain, and it's really understanding the, if you will, the journey that the perpetrator goes through psychologically and process-wise, and understanding that behavior. In business, that would be studying how people perform roles in a process using technology to achieve valuable outcomes. But those similar processes, yes, there's aberrations, of course, you have to plan for too, but there is a standard process many of these people go through in their thinking, and you're trying to interrupt that before they act. And that's been kind of the underlying architecture of retail, preventing retail theft for some time. But some things have changed. Forces of change have occurred now in the United States. And it's exponential in its impact on what's happening to companies, whether it's distribution or retail stores. Tell me a little bit about that. Does that make sense to you? You're studying in a sense, the process of an individual offender trying to get left to bang on him before he steals. Is that correct?
That's right. And we use the same terms, left at and right of bang, for those reasons. And I was an infantry officer too, so I kind of was used to that terminology. But we're like, everything is sort of a fish swimming in a sea, and the sea is the context. And so we have to zoom in and we have to zoom out and all around and how we think about these things, because the leg bone is connected to the hip bone. And so in the case of why does crime appear to be rising, both acquisitive or theft, larceny, fraud type crime, as well as crimes against persons, the violence and aggression. And part of it is many of us require a lot of oversight. And so that's the criminal justice system. Maybe that's the formal sanctions that are out there. And we've seen a steady erosion of consequences for would-be offenders. The downside's not there. And this is a sort of out in left field a little bit, but think about Putin. People execute these things if their calculus, their rational choice in their mind is, there's a lot more upside than downside here. I'm going for it. So that's our role, is to try and understand that and affect how they perceive the world, and then how they make their calculus and execute on that, or progress once they've executed. So that's the erosion of consequences probably started with baby boomer retirements, some of the up and down funding at the local level for law enforcement. But then it sort of was exacerbated, it looks like, throughout the pandemic, obviously with the civil unrest, the defund the police movements. We're not going to have McGruff the crime dog. We can't have cops on TV, that show, and things like that anymore. And so you saw a lot of good officers move to other agencies or move out of law enforcement, or just retire a little earlier than they would have liked. And so that results in what we all know. You're moving many detectives are having to be moved into patrol roles just to get to some level of patrol in these jurisdictions that these retailers we work with are. And the retailers we're working with represent just about 250,000 retail locations around the US and the world. And so, but particularly in the US, they've seen that erosion of consequences. The same thing with the prosecutors, that many prosecutors are elected officials. They're there, like the law enforcement officers, to safeguard their community. But if they were elected in a low turnout election, an LTE, where maybe 50 to 150,000 people elected somebody in a jurisdiction that might include 1 million or more voters, you can see some of the outcomes. You've got somebody that maybe lacks skill, or is an activist, or just doesn't have a deep understanding of human behavior. We always want to be optimistic, but at the end of the day, we live in a dangerous neighborhood called the world, and we have to live in reality. And so I think those combinations have reduced the downside risk for the offenders at the macro level.
What I love about you being on the University of Florida campus is how you've leveraged that, because you can bring your DNA from your research, your applied research, and working within the use cases that you're developing. And you can create proof of concepts within your innovation center on the University of Florida campus. At the same time, you can navigate the social issues as well. And that is, we're constantly navigating this intersection between privacy and our ability to protect our people and our assets. We're constantly doing that. We're not China. We can't just make a authoritarian judgment on what we need to keep you safe. We need buy-in. We need cultural buy-in. How are you navigating that with companies like NVIDIA and of course your end users like Walmart and your manufacturers as well? How are you all navigating the social and the technology advancements we've made?
Well, it's tricky, as you can imagine, Ron. What the university gives you is, you're now an academically trained research scientist, right? That's really what a PhD is, a research degree. You're supposed to be able to conduct a rigorous assessment of anything, not just your own discipline, but what you learn how to use theory or frameworks. What have others learned? What's the world look like? How do the dominoes, which domino starts and where does it hit next, the next domino, and things like that? That's theory or frameworks. We learn how to rigorously evaluate things so that we can, determine between, is this kind of co-varying, correlated, or is this a causal relationship? And then is there something we can do about that to better safeguard? And we have things like IRBs, institutional review boards, so that we work with human subjects, participants. And so our research should do no harm, should result in good evidence, but we're translational scientists, right? So we're going to use all this rigor and we're going to translate that to real action on the street in the real world. And so we all the time, I just got off the phone with another retailer a few minutes ago that's just got a really cool job as a vice president at a growing sports chain, who grew up in a big retailer and worked with us. But the point is, those guys keep us honest. Here's what I'm seeing. Here's what I need to know. So we talk to them every week. We talk to the criminal offenders. We had offenders in our labs last week and the week before. We also work with them out in the wild or in the field. So we combine all the rigorous science and frameworks and things, but we work in the real world with real problems, and we're helping people hopefully solve those problems. But the privacy issue is a big one. Privacy to us is a construct that's transactional. It's transitory. In other words, it's not an absolute thing. It's what somebody thinks it is right then and there, but they will exchange that value exchange we talked about before, that VX. Hey, you know what? For convenience, I'm going to do this. And if you buy something on a website, you're giving up all your personal information. So why is it different at a brick and mortar store and other places where people are getting hurt, intimidated, and really billions of dollars worth of merchandise is being stolen annually?
I personally just had an aha, and I'm reminded of an experience. I was on vacation in a hotel pool and got to speaking with an Australian executive. And after a period of time, he said, I'm very curious. I like to ask Americans what they think the biggest problem in the world is. And for a moment, I paused and I was thinking, the biggest challenge we have is whether democracy is efficient enough, fast enough, agile enough, adaptable enough to compete in the world against authoritarianism. And it just flashed on me as you were speaking. And I think the aha moment is how it is an age-old problem of human beings. And that is, every tool we create can be used for good or evil. But so it's going to come down to core values, I believe. You talked about, we are going to have the same or better technology as the authoritarian regimes, but we might have in our hands a core value. Let's go back to your core value for a second. Safeguarding vulnerable people and places that allows us to maybe deal with that power in a much more responsible way, a much more democratic way than authoritarian regimes. But can we stay efficient? Can we stay adaptable and agile, Reed, and still maintain those core values?
That's a huge question. But everything, as you said, can be used for good and evil. But if we can establish, and I love the idea of this is a core value, this is where we start and this is where we end. But
Right.
It doesn't mean we do anything to safeguard vulnerable people. It means that's our mandate, that's our goal, our objective, our mission, our passion. And so we're going to take into account other people's perceptions. We're going to ask them systematically, all the legitimate and illicit place users, and get their perspectives, but we're still not going to not safeguard because somebody somewhere sometime might be offended. And most of the time when somebody's offended, it's because they're not informed. And when we say, okay, given your concerns, what if you had to now find an employee because this item is now locked up if we don't have the technology? And you're in a massive store, it's difficult to find service anyway, or the technology's here, you can select it and you can make the transaction and go home. They're like, never mind, I like the convenience.
Or even the safety. You end up having
That's
an
right.
extreme event, an X event on the campus. It could be a hurricane. It could be anything. And there's a bunch of people locked in a building and you don't know who they are because you don't have identity because your privacy was restricting your ability to collect that identity. So we have all sorts of choices to make, but I love your red line of core values as you navigate those issues. Let's go to another topic. Reed, I got a hold of you because it's been some time now and your mission is expanded, it's accelerating. What are some of the new developments that are happening right now and we can anticipate in the future from your work?
I'm going to use two words, Ron. One is going to be harm. The other is going to be integration. And so one thing we're doing in 2022 is we're really building up, collecting data, evidence around what's the real harm when one person victimizes another or a place. What's the real harm here? What's the harm to an individual that's victimized or is in that place during that crime? What's the emotional, psychological harm to them? What's the financial harm to that place? What's the harm in the near term if people don't want to work or shop there anymore because they view it as dangerous? They have a fear of criminal victimization themselves, a fear of crime, right? What's the harm to the enterprise in the aggregate from all this that's going on? And we can define that. And then finally to that community where now resources have to go there or that store closes because of the first three that are occurring. So harm is a big thing that we're defining right now. As we look at the typologies, there's different types of commercial burglary, robbery, and everything. We're defining that, but we're defining the harm in much greater detail. And I think that could also help counter some of the negative narratives that are out there against protection, policing, security, asset protection, things like that. The second one is integration. And I can't tell you how many of the retailers from Australia through the US and elsewhere are saying, I've had it. I have all these things I'm doing, but there's not an integrated strategy. I need to work on that. But these things don't talk to each other, and a lot of them could. How do I get my solution partners and myself integrated, what we do integrated, how things function integrated? And so that's what we're working a lot on, Ron, on both of those.
It seems to be a topic that's near and present too, and and not only the technology being able to do this now, but also it looks like many of the risk resilience and security people around the nation are finally getting business buy-off on the fact that it has to be done. One of the conversations I've been having recently is if we can think of our ecosystem, and you explained what that ecosystem was earlier in this conversation, if you can think of that ecosystem all having a shared benefit from the resolution of confronting these kind of problems, then you begin to then create almost an interstate highway, if you will, that connects them, that can trade intelligence, just like they have with goods and services, and can start to contextualize a whole picture, if you will. I'm seeing more of that in the protective intelligence space. Is that what you're referring to, or are you thinking of something else?
So I think it's inclusive of what you just described, Ron. We've got to have, as we mentioned before, earlier detection, earlier and better definition. We've got to be able to disseminate that information to the right people at the right time, at speed, more accurate information that way. And we've got to have that supports the right decision making, whether it's a manager at an individual place or it's at the enterprise level or somewhere in between. It's coordinating with local law enforcement, on-scene people, particularly during these emergent situations, the mass robs, the active assailants, and some of the other things that we're dealing with right now in our area of expertise. So I think that it is inclusive of all the above. We've got to get ahead of these things. As you said, let's go farther and farther left of bang if we can. But we deal with bang too. And then finally, we deal with right of bang. That's a big part of this. How do we shut down places that people convert stolen goods to cash? How do we affect some of the steps and stages the offender takes to be successful?
Right. Also, it dawned on me as we thought about your core values, safeguarding vulnerable people and places. Those people are defined by their roles in a process. So it's not just the citizen on the campus, it's also the institution itself. So vulnerable people takes on, back to the integration between the ecosystem, people are harmed within their personal, their professional, their communal settings. And so your term takes on an expansive meaning.
Well, I love it. And think about the connections between places too, Ron. That's important. Like here at UF, we have a National Science Foundation, an NSF grant, which is kind of the platinum standard at Research One universities. But where we're looking at that, okay, how do we better safeguard that campus, which is pretty, over 2,000 acres, 70,000 humans working and schooling there, researching. But there's connections into where they live, where they shop, and the broader community. So it's safeguarding each of the places that they are, but the connections between those places are also important. So we have to build that communication stuff. We're doing a lot. Another thing I should emphasize is mapping, visualizing to problem solve, visualizing to tell the story, to get the resources, funding that you need to affect the issue. Of my 3 new research scientists that joined my team, all 3 of them have from good to better to best mapping skills. So you're going to see a lot of that going on.
Mapping. Help me help all of us define that a little bit more. What do you mean by mapping?
Well, I mean, some of the members that just joined, we mentioned NVIDIA and Lenovo, Intel, and others, but also ESRI, ESRI, with their ArcGIS, ArcPro platform. They've joined the LPRC. They've provided us licensing, additional training. We are looking at, here's an example, an active robbery series that's happening as you and I are speaking right now in South Florida, Dade and Broward County, and Auto Parts, one of the major auto parts retail chains in America. They have had 9 of their stores victimized by a 3-man armed robbery crew. Okay, there's nothing more dangerous and scary and traumatizing as an armed robbery, in many cases when it comes to crime anyway. And so what can we do about that? Well, let's map all that chain stores, not just the ones that were victimized, but that were robbed. Let's also map all the other auto parts chain stores that were also not victimized. So only this chain has been hit, not 2 other major competitors of theirs. So what's the direction of travel? Let's look at the spatio-temporal movement. Let's look at how they progressed in place and time, but also, are they setting patterns? Are they progressing also in the tactics they're using? Can we pull together video to tell the story outside the building and in, right, left, at, and right of bang? How did they get there? What did they do there? What did they do after they left? Can we tell that story using mapping with video clips that are inserted with all? So again, now we're looking at the roadways to travel. Is there a central point where these people seem to be operating out of? Because there are 3 robbers instead of 1, it's more difficult and so on. So we could go on and why not? But that's one example.
Yeah. And of course, using state-of-the-art machine learning AI skills to begin to recognize those patterns and then provide you a visual and an analytical map to be able to decide what your actionable strategies are. Is that right?
That's right. And if you look out at our UF Safer Places Lab, the 4 square block area, you're going to see live view trailer platforms out there with, again, that's got LiDAR, radar, thermal radar, different types of day-night cameras, microphone sensors, speakers, strobes, things that we can do to affect behavior before an individual comes to that place, maybe even online. Hey, did you see this? And so on. We can study that too, those effects before they get there, the effects near side as they approach. We can use other cameras and try and understand how the technology does that. And then on site, how does that safeguard the green shopper, the one we want there, the good employer, customer, or visitor? How does it affect the red guy, the bad guy, and their behavior? Do we get U-turns? Do we get comments? What's going on there? But then using those platforms to also study that behavior in addition to getting the impact that we want, meshing those together now, mesh the 4 blocks together, a fusion, pull them into our SOC lab, start to understand at different scales how we better safeguard people and do it in a cost-effective way that's also encouraging good behavior while discouraging bad behavior, the whole spectrum.
Let's end on this note. You are doing such seminal, fantastic work. And define for a second who your ideal partners look like. You know, you've mentioned now already partners like Lenovo and NVIDIA. You've talked about partners like Walmart. But tell me what an ideal supporter of your work looks like and how they might get in contact with you if they hear this for the first time.
Well, that's a great question. Okay, so I think that we've got most of the major retailers, and we've got, vice president level, officer level members from those retailers, almost 70 of these corporations and all their divisions and chains under them. We've got about 85 technology companies. There's a few that we'd like we don't have, Microsoft, Qualcomm, Cisco, IBM, that probably could help us pull together platforms that might have some of the chips that would be helpful, that have a lot of expertise at the smart city level, right? That smart and connected community level, in addition to what we're doing at that place level or out in the ozone. I think companies that could help us, and we've got one and maybe another coming on that can help us better define, scrape, detect threats and other things online, chatter that we should know earlier that we can use to make sense. Again, whether it's a shoplifting group or it's an active killer assailant. Again, we need earlier detection. We need better communication. We need better connections. That's
outstanding. Reed, I want to thank you once again for joining us. It's been a great conversation. It was great to catch up with you. And again, I'm right now one of the purveyors of your data as it comes across LinkedIn and off your website. I really appreciate your work and the people who are supporting you, Reed.
I say the same thing about you, Ron, and your work, your podcast, and the things that you do to make these connections and really help us all move forward together. We couldn't do it at the same level without you.
This has been a great conversation with Dr. Reed Hayes.